Hello YouTubers, I'm going to tackle today a difficult subject, the subject of Jesus and sexuality. I hesitate to get into it because there's always such a great chance of being misunderstood, and I'm really prompted to get into it because of the amount of disinformation and acrimony which is coming from both sides in Australia's current marriage equality debate. I am somewhat qualified by my writings and studies to talk on this subject, but even so, there's a danger, particularly if you deal with press and media on these kind of subjects, that you get sensationalized or you get edited out in certain areas, and one way or another what you really mean, what you really want to say, doesn't get represented. So if you're going to say anything at all, it's really rather good to use a video as a medium, because then it's there on record, and although it doesn't make for the most exciting video to watch, I think it's quite good if I just read a text and then what I've said. So, and I think you would find that some of the claims and insights and declarations are quite interesting, sometimes even in their way exciting. So I will just go ahead and read. It's often claimed and widely believed that Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. At most, it's thought by the more liberal-minded that Jesus may have gestured kindly in the direction of gays, as in the story of the healing of the centurion's much-loved servant or boy, Pice. It was quite common in Roman times for centurions to keep young men, and many would be considered, in modern terms, gay. The word itself didn't exist in Jesus' times, which in their extrovert way described almost everything by random acts as opposed to psychological dispositions or tendencies. What, however, I'll be considering here is Jesus on the subject of sexuality, and even the vexed question of Jesus' own sexuality. Some have regarded Jesus as married to the Magdalene, others as involved with the beloved disciple John, and some, still perhaps the majority and more traditionally, as completely asexual or ascetically anti-sexual, and so on. It might be thought no conclusive answers can ever be given, and some would say it wouldn't matter, whatever the answer, but real answers and their implications are the point of this video. However improbable it might sound, I claim as a writer on religion and doctor of religious studies to have some definitive answers, and they should have been known and used long ago amid relevant controversies. My claim will sound a bit less impressive to those who haven't already listened to my Signs, Rumours and Forecasts of Apocalypse YouTube, where I confidently assert the birth data for Jesus have been found, and they seriously work for Jesus' issues to this day. But even at that, and if you totally dismiss the remarkably revealing patterns I present, I have always maintained I could make virtually identical claims from factors hidden in plain sight in the Gospels and elsewhere in the New Testament. I can only scratch the surface of the very big subject of Jesus and sexuality, and it could surprise some if I say that what I claim is not in itself novel. Especially Jewish Christians like Bishop Hugh Montefiore and Canon Paul Oestreicher have speculated that Jesus was in some sense quite likely gay, and one of Christianity's certifiably gay saints, St. Aelred of Rievaulx, may be said to have implied the same centuries ago when he affirmed Jesus was as good as married to the beloved disciple. There are others who know or suspect the fact, but they won't admit to it. Years ago, the son of a prominent theologian and expert in John's Gospel told me it had long been his father's private nightmare that it seemed to him Jesus must be gay. Of course, you can propose that a lot of us are deluded, not just on a scholarly basis, but spiritually, even demonically, a point I will address near the end of this talk. But what is original here is why I make the claim at all, and with what kind of proof. Resistance to the very idea of Jesus on the human side being what singer Elton John would say was, quotes, a very clever gay man, a sort of Leonardo da Vinci type, you might say, is maintained in conservative, especially American Christian circles, by the conviction that all homosexuality must be a result of the fall, and thus has the status of a disease. There only ever was Adam and Eve, so any Adam and Steve variation on the main theme is unthinkable, and where homosexuality expresses itself, it's described as a, quotes, lifestyle, quotes, which, though perhaps true for some, obscures in most instances one is dealing with an orientation and one given from birth. Childhood sexual abuse and two other factors I won't get into may give the impression the orientation can be cured or abandoned, but this is not normally the case. I would even suggest it is a more soul-based condition, much larger than just a sex issue, and it's one that science will perhaps never quite certify, but that hidden factors can. I shall briefly return to this, but first I want to cover some things Jesus actually said. 2 points seem especially relevant. In the Sermon on the Mount, and addressing the subject of anger in the course of his interiorization of the law, Jesus declares that one must not call one's brother a fool or raca. It could risk the hellfire. On the surface, this doesn't make much sense, as people carelessly and casually call one another fool all the time. What your Bible doesn't tell you or translate appropriately is that raca was an Aramaic abuse term, a slang word a bit like faggot, and implying gross effeminacy. It's pretty clear that Jesus is using the existence of homophobic type abuse as symbolic of all outsider and racist type vilification of people, which can lead to violence or even murder if not cut off at the mental root. A near contemporary of Jesus, the Jewish philosopher Philo, understood the Leviticus ban on same-sex behavior as involved with sacred prostitution. And quite likely it originally and most essentially was, because how many gay men really want to lie with a man as with a woman? But in many ancient societies, prostitutes were pretty boys dressed as women. Be that as it may, in much of the ancient world, same-sex interaction often involved prostitution, or was even directed upon prisoners of war. Anyway, it was a mark of disgrace, something you could easily be abusive about. I suggest the fact that Jesus singles out a type of ancient world homophobic abuse tells us two things. First, at least implicitly, it allows Jesus to quietly cancel the capital penalty of the Leviticus ban. Under Leviticus, one could be perfectly justified to hold violent and even murderous feelings towards those one considered perverts. But if you weren't meant to harbour such feelings, what would that do to the ban more widely? You would become like a murderer in God's sight to carry out the ruling. But beyond this, I'm going to suggest that the raca subject was quite personal to Jesus, because he had experienced some kind of abuse in this area. Why suspect this? Amazingly and improbably, there is an asteroid raca, and in Jesus' birth pattern it conjuncts Honoria, honour, and falls challengingly opposite to, of all things, the part of sexuality. This in turn is in quincunx aspect, an adjustments to be made aspect to the part of homosexuality. I can't read this other than to see Jesus' honour would be challenged by some species of raca type abuse concerning his orientation, attitudes towards which he will seek to redeem. But how did Jesus perceive himself when it came to sexuality? It's never stated that Jesus was married, and since rabbis would need to be so, one would suspect he only got away with not being so because he didn't need to be married for some reason, such as being associated with the Essenes. It's a vexing question whether Jesus did in fact have any Essene connections, but suggestive that he did is that the only Essene-associated asteroid Qumran is within conjunction of his identity-giving son. Be that as it may, the answer to the question of how Jesus saw himself is likely to have been given, again through Matthew's Gospel, this time in chapter 19, when amid discussion of marriage, Jesus speaks of those who have become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. It is important to be aware, as some of us are, especially since Norwegian theologian Ragnhild Shanker entered the scholarly fray, that in Jesus' time eunuch could be a fairly broad term. It need not automatically mean either castrate or celibate, and it could even sometimes cover, for the nearest ancient world, equivalent to gay. Personally, I see it a bit like the old expression confirmed bachelor, which could mean what it said, or could mean something more alternative. Those that Jesus calls eunuchs made by man are obviously castrates, but those who are eunuchs from their mother's wombs are hardly castrate or celibate or asexual, or only a tiny fraction might be, so it has to mean out of the norm, not naturally attracted to the opposite sex in the normal way. Interesting and useful as this item of information is, we must still ask why Jesus would want or approve followers to be like eunuchs if they weren't to be all and always total ascetics for the kingdom of heaven. This looks to be how the alarmed disciples, with perhaps lack of imagination towards possible ramifications, spontaneously took it to mean, and which of course could sometimes apply. It might, for example, be better for some missionaries in danger zones not to marry. And to the disciples' surprised reaction to his teaching on marriage, Jesus responds, not everyone can take the same. And under any interpretation, this has been and probably always would be the case. But if the eunuch ideal is not exclusively about marriage and celibacy, the reason why Jesus' followers need to become eunuchs is, I suggest, because they could use an outsider consciousness, the sense of difference so often deemed fundamental to being gay, even, according to some, its greatest gift. To be fully integrated to this world is just not to be truly Christian. And Jesus was, as his birth data indicated, all of a eunuch in the widest sense. He surely tries to tell his disciples this when he declares some are born eunuchs from their mother's wombs, in itself, and for his times, a very original idea. In the extroverted ancient world, only the astrologers assumed there was anything like a homosexual fate or identity from birth. The rest assumed people did what they did rather than that they were what they were across time. That more typically ancient outlook seems to have echoes in St. Paul, who only seemed able to see men as randomly and perversely exchanging the way of nature. We today might speak of Roman decadence being recreationally bisexual, but there is no need here to go into the various debated meanings attributed to St. Paul on same sex, or whatever precisely he had in mind, which is something less certain than fundamentalists and some Bible translations would have us believe. Anyway, Jesus makes an admission and accepts there is an inborn alternative orientation. If it's gay, plainly one doesn't pray this gay away, rather one embraces and uses it. It's an aspect of one's being and spirituality. How do I reasonably suspect that at this point Jesus wasn't just making a controversial, easily misunderstood statement, but beyond that admitting something more personal to himself, and almost, one might say, coming out to his disciples? Once again, we look at Jesus' birth data. The Hebrew word for eunuch is saras, and it can mean out of the family way, different. As it happens, asteroid Saras significantly conjuncts Jesus' Mercury, the androgynous planet which rules his Gemini ascendant, and thus issues around his body and self-image. This, however, isn't all. That same body and image-relevant ascendant is conjunct of all asteroids in the heavens born. We now have the very signature of Jesus' words, some are born eunuchs. If this isn't telling us Jesus was born gay and he knew it and wished to declare it, what is? Especially if we then look to find signs of significant relating in Jesus' chart. Forget trendy theories that Jesus was married to the Magdalene. His part of marriage is directly opposed to Magdalena at birth. Bachelor is on Jesus' union's house cusp, which is in Sagittarius, sign of organized religion, which I fancy covers for all those ideas of Jesus being wedded to an institution, the church. But within the relevant house sector we find, as we might guess, San Juan, St. John, quite apart from the fact that Johannes is in favourable, easy trine to the part of homosexuality to supply a same-sex flavour. And though modern scholarship questions this, definitely John was the beloved disciple, author of the gospel named for him. Johannes more than once describes himself as a witness to Jesus. Witness is martyr in Greek, and it conjuncts the San Juan name in the union's house, as does Bibliolexa, which empirically I have found works for Bible as New Testament. San Juan is besides in favourable aspect to Antieros, with its suggestion of beloved. I nevertheless don't believe there was any sexual relation here, and not because Jesus would maintain all same-sex relations to be intrinsically wrong for all people for all time, but because with Jesus claiming what he did, and John believing what he did, no gospel writer stresses the divinity more strongly, neither party would have ventured into anything like the transgression of boundaries attributed to the fallen angels with the daughters of men in Genesis. Such relating would be something beyond all possible interpretation or reinterpretation or cancellation of any Jewish law. The relation of Jesus and John nonetheless had something of the Platonic relation of master and pupil lover, in which the pupil achieves new perception and being through the teacher. I have described this in the second part of my Testament of the Magi book, and if you once see it, much that may be previously unclear falls into place, and you may never quite read John's Gospel in the same way again. To value same-sex relating, even to being a model in some way for all love, raises the question, what exactly does same-sex orientation mean, and why should Jesus incarnate as gay? Even centuries earlier, and when eunuch was more associated with castration, there was already the hint, as in Isaiah 56:4, that the eunuch might be carrying something valuable or superior. At any rate, it seems his memorial or reward is to be greater than sons and daughters, i.e. the heterosexual experience. The earliest gay liberationists of the 19th century, borrowing some ideas from Jewish mysticism, theorized a female soul in a male body in the case of gays, and a male soul in a female body in lesbians. We needn't take this as an invariable rule, but I think there can be little question homosexuality is primarily an issue of soul, and best referred to hidden orders of reality that precisely astrology can give some clues to. I suggest Jesus was necessarily gay because the underlying androgyny of homosexuality renders him more representative of the human race. It allowed him to be what he is biblically described as being, namely at once the male logos or word and the female sophia or wisdom, than if he is all male in the way once desired by so-called muscular Christianity. Also, to be gay at all is to be born under patterns more related to the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, which represent the most spiritually potent forces, and Jesus is necessarily related to these ultimately Trinitarian energies. It is because gays tend to be more related to the spiritual planets than the average, that their character can take on an extremist, excitable, addictive, eccentric, or depressive cast. Despite their obvious disagreements on some things, observers have noted the element of similarity between activist gays and committed Christians, especially the early Christians, who in no time were accused of turning the world upside down, and who manifestly made those of their in-group an extended family. The observation is not misguided. There is a Uranian revolutionary quality to gay organization and conduct that has Christian parallels. Even the fate of gays and Christians is often similar. As in Azerbaijan today, whole societies may persecute both groups as representing unacceptable difference in individuality. This situation connects with my earlier point that Jesus said his followers should be eunuchs for the kingdom. To be Christian is to be just a little bit Uranian gay, leave sleepy tradition-bound churches to the life of Saturnian straits. Uranus is futuristic, trendy, and in for the excitement. The classic biblical gay character is not the effectively bisexual, often cited David, who loved Jonathan above women, but the unmarried and very radical Jeremiah, who lived with his secretary Baruch. There's much to learn about and from Jeremiah, as I have written in my narrative poem Jeremiah's Loincloth and the commentary on it. It's on my main blog, McCleary's Alternatives on the Net. Indeed, if you can't factor in an element of gay psychology and fate at work in Jeremiah's life, there are things you are never going quite to understand about that prophet and the esoteric dimension of sex. It is also worth noting that, suitably for someone his contemporaries compared to Jeremiah, that Jesus has asteroid Jeremias prominently connected. Some people today say it doesn't and couldn't matter whether Jesus was in some sense gay or not. On the contrary, I suggest this is something of vital importance to be aware of within the context of modern society with its different social values and psychological knowledge from those of biblical times. But before I even state what I see as the uses of understanding Jesus' sexuality, I had perhaps better interpose something to stop troll-like critics from proposing I have only proved Jesus was little better than a fashioner of or recruiter for homosexuality itself by his notorious, but in fact notoriously misunderstood or mistranslated Sermon on the Mount statement about any man looking at a woman to lust after her has committed adultery. The average person could be justified in thinking that if all and any sight of nudity is forbidden and no man should feel erotic stirrings, procreation will cease and perversion will ensue, and there's enough of it in some supposedly celibate clerical circles as it is. It should be stressed, Jesus' subject is adultery, and you can only commit adultery with a married person. So translation would better run whoever looks upon a married woman to lust after her. But then the Greek word to look has connotations of to consider and to have in mind to do something rather than simply looking at a body. The meaning should be clear, namely that whether your desire is fulfilled or not, if you intend to have someone else's partner, then you can be considered to have done that, and are thus guilty before God, whether you succeed or not. It is quite amusing that a best-selling writer on end times issues, Hal Lindsey, is one of those who highlight this verse to prove to readers that they're all guilty sinners before God because they have all harbored erotic thoughts. Since Lindsay is familiar with the divorce courts, having had 4 wives, it seems ironic that he and other American Christians should seek to burden minds in this way, but it's not atypical of American evangelicalism. All sorts of questions also arrive from Jesus' dictum re adulteri for gay relating, which tends to be less possessive and perhaps more eros-based than the relating of gays. I touch on this in my extended essay on the net, Beyond Marriage Equality, Queer Fantasy and Christian Disinformation, What Does Being Gay Today Mean? I incline, like Rabbi Botach, towards a kind of tantric view here. Sufficient to say, it's unnecessary to regard Jesus, himself a descendant of Solomon, presumed author of the Song of Songs, as only a controversially radical ascetic, opposed to every sight and feeling of the erotic. If anything, almost the opposite. Jesus, who was born with factors like Venus conjunct Neptune conjunct Eros in sex sign Scorpio, is almost the summation of the erotic, and why not? If God created sex and Jesus is divine, how could it be otherwise? So some reimagining of Jesus and his values would seem requisite in this area. Reverting to the main issue, which is why Jesus' sexuality and knowing about it matters, I believe there can be no modification of the opinions of the more conservative Christians, in especially America, unless and until they realize a core sexual truth about a Jesus they'd better stop insulting on the homosexuality subject, along with a fair number of his followers. Until they do, despite changed views in some circles, gay children will continue to be thrown onto the street from some of the stricter Christian homes, with the result, I'm told, they constitute the largest single group of the homeless in America. That scandal must stop. At the same time, this is not to propose Jesus' natural friend to the latest political correctness drives where sex and sexuality are concerned. In fact, he would not be. And though I do regard many Christians, through their needless intransigence towards gays, as having allowed a full secularist onslaught to have been raised against them, I don't see Jesus as siding with the kind of legal rulings which require individuals to support gays against conscience, even if we might sometimes question the conscience. To be against conscience is always dangerous. I have stressed that Jesus, very originally for his times, defined homosexuality in essentialist terms, as most gays today tend to do. This is not to say he defined it in contemporary, trendy, academically popular queer theory terms. Owing almost more to bisexuality and cultural Marxism than to gays and gay theory, according to queer ideology, identity has no essence, and ethics has no real status, beyond perhaps a generous inclusiveness, so that anyone can choose any sexual role or conduct any time. Sex becomes virtually a secular, unspiritual game or experiment, with which obviously Christianity has no truck, or none this side of the profane. If you read books like the late shock-jock bisexual Argentinian theologian Marcela Althaus-Reid, professor of contextual theology at Edinburgh University, in such studies as her Indecent Theology or The Queer God, you will hear that the Ten Commandments are elitist, you will hear of Mary queer of heaven, of building the unjust Messiah, leading God by a dog's collar, of God the sodomite, of polyfidelity as building community solidarity, and on like this. I had always thought Revelation's condemnation of the Jezebel at Ephesus a bit over the top and too close for comfort to a product of just some patriarchal imagination rather than any known reality. But Althaus-Reid is one who has caused me to seriously reconsider. And beyond Marcella, the influence of queer theorists on LGBT policy is plain alarming. No gays are safe from it. Even if you have the status of the likes of fashionistas Dolce and Gabbana, who said they weren't keen on gays having kids, a sentiment shared by quite a few gays. The queer establishment is screaming the house down. There were even calls for the fashion house to be boycotted. Under queer, you can be or do anything but democratically express an honest opinion. Years ago, when my then groundbreaking gay spiritualities doctorate was published in UK as a special illumination, one or two critics remarked they found me alarmist towards queer theology. Since then, I think any alarm to have been well justified. Queer theology and its related theology, queer theory, and its related theology finishes undermining of all and any religion. Another reviewer of my work and associate of the then Archbishop of Canterbury felt my study was a good resource summarising and assessing gay theology and various trends. I had also assessed pagan trends, for which ironically I had some affinity, since they embraced the esoteric dimension of sexuality, which Christians dismiss at their peril. Whether it's gay or straight, contemporary Christian theology too often lacks soul, but is well provided with implicit or explicit politics, and so has been very open to queer theory. I am not therefore too surprised that my work, which could have been used as precisely a resource and helped a few councils to be more informed amid their debate of gay ideas and theologies, about which they often knew too little, would hit the wall and finish almost wholly ignored, as quite probably will this video, unless someone cares to make a scandal out of it. Thousands hit sites about gay Christian affairs, which will tell them much less than I have to offer, but that's the way of the world, I fancy. Even so, the extent to which since 2003 my work would be ignored or misrepresented is a bit absurd. At least some of the problem looks to be an American parochialism or resentment around anyone outside America having their say. Notable gay Christians in America won't be in touch. But whatever the cause, it has meant I would not pursue what could have been valuable, needed postdoctoral studies in gay ethics. And I've not written further on what was once my expertise. I no longer even keep up with it and have even grown quite rusty on it as I've turned to other interests. In studying gay spiritualities, back in 2003, I was being so original that Australia had not even heard of the subject when it was first mentioned in relation to me. However, my standing as any kind of Antipodean authority on the subject was seriously compromised from the outset, not least by the ridiculous assertions of the religion journalist Tess Livingstone, Cardinal Pell's biographer. She actually maintained the Australian government had funded me to research Jesus' sexuality, a subject which obviously did not feature in my formal studies, and about which I didn't have the information I now claim to possess. Never believe the nonsense that all publicity is good publicity. It isn't. Ms. Livingstone plainly aimed to make me sound ridiculous, and somewhat succeeded, as news shot round the world and there was next to no opportunity to correct any damage done. As I listened to reports of the current same-sex marriage debate, I don't believe Australia, nor perhaps press and media anywhere, is capable of dealing with the Jesus and sexuality issue apart from sensation and entertainment. One wretched journalist even made out I believe Jesus came to earth to have sex with his disciples. I was not allowed to pursue this horror through proper press complaint channels in Australia. Not only on same-sex issues, I find it increasingly unsafe to have dealings with media. One needs something like the equivalent of a prenup agreement to ensure you and your ideas are properly represented, assuming they're wanted, which on anything religious or against tides of popular opinion they're often not anyway. Back in 2015, when I happened to be in Ireland, place of my other nationality, and around the time of the historic gay marriage plebiscite, thanks to the indifference of the religion editor, I was not even able to get anything of my opinions into the Irish Times. So much for being something of an expert on gay affairs, Ireland scarcely has any, or a published author. In the days of equality, you're more likely to be sent to the back of the queue than welcome to the front if you actually know something. But it perhaps didn't help that, like gay activist Keith Mills, an agnostic rather than clerical leader of Ireland's No Vote, I had my questions about what was going on, the ideas and pressures being expressed and exerted. Mills particularly disliked how marriage equality would abolish what he regarded as a reasonable enough preference by state and agencies being directed to heterosexual married couples for adoption of children. I retain mixed feelings about the whole so-called marriage equality drive and its conduct in both Ireland and Australia. Like Mills, I believe in same-sex unions, and since I believe there is some value and sometimes a duty for gays to be distinctive rather than apparently same, I think that unions better represent social diversity. Achieving a psychologically healing sameness through marriage is one of the stated, if not actual, aims of the marriage equality movement, but which for my and many people's likes has too many bullism fanatics pushing an agenda, as recent events in Australia and places where same-sex marriage is instituted have shown. One needs to read between the lines these days, but the new society trained to Twitter and the soundbite can hardly see beyond ideas of the love is love variety. I promise to say a few words about my authority to pronounce on some things in religion, as I have done. Some will want to be assured God has spoken to me, or suspect that, if not, that the devil has. I don't say that God has never spoken to me. My book, Cosmic Father, Spirituality as Relationship, is a record of a sequence of experiences and insights of a kind I wouldn't necessarily expect to have again in my lifetime. But on the subject of Jesus' birth and character, no revelation has been given me directly, that is. Years ago, however, I was pursued over the net about my work and beliefs by someone claiming prophetic gifts and who seemed to have them. There is no question this individual knew things they couldn't possibly know about friends of mine that they'd never met, and I was even pressured to give one a message I was reluctant to convey, though things worked out well enough when I did. This self-described prophet wanted to know more about my researches in astrology and also sexuality, and when I sent him some material, was troubled about their direction. In the end, I grew impatient and suggested he might go to Jesus about the subject, and even also ask why I suffered so many difficulties conveying the information. Eventually, I was informed that, to the prophet's surprise, Jesus had told him that what I knew was right, and what was meant to be known and told in the world, and it only wasn't because of spiritual blindness in believers and unbelievers alike. Many are truths told in jest. I still hear the despairing, ironic response of an atheist family friend when I touched on the matter over a lunch at the Savoy. Well, there's nothing like confirmation from the highest source, is there? Which I suppose there isn't, and you must make what you will of the prophet's message to me, and likewise now my final observations. It's too late now to tell the churches much more than the following, whose reflections finally linked to others of my recent stars, rumours and forecasts talk. Your lack of compromise and even repentance for past wrongs, including all the violence and bullying towards minorities you ignored or even endorsed, has already unnecessarily lost you the culture wars and made secular law more intransigent. Don't now make the mistake, which will only occasion more incredulity and hostility in secular circles, of identifying gay rights and freedoms with nothing but Sodom and Gomorrah revived, an end times phenomenon which last, it is to some extent, the age of Pisces, whose last gasps admittedly risk blurring every issue, including somewhat over gender under the influence of the likes of the half-incoherent Piscean ideologue Judith Butler, is virtually ended, and the Aquarian age, which may prove the utopian millennium of Christian prophecy, is soon to dawn. But Aquarius is ruled by Uranus, the planet at its highest level of the spirit, but more mundanely of radical, independent, difference, and anything and anyone gay. It is impossible that the same-sex revolution, with all its spiritual ramifications, will not, at some level, be considerably accepted and prominent in the future. Amid the many errors and sometimes sexual excesses of the times, a change of consciousness is nonetheless in process. Oppose it uncritically and wholesale, and you will only find that you are opposing God, even insulting the Jesus who warns you against saying and thinking Racha.